I started college as a musical theater major. And I went on to be a history major, and I focused on medieval and Renaissance British history, which was not the most practical thing that I could have majored in. At a certain point, I needed to get more practical about what I was going to be doing in my life. So I decided I was going to go to law school.
24-year-old Jessica Ravel grew up in New Jersey and is in her second year of law school at Rutgers University when the unthinkable happens nearby.
Okay, it sounds like we have some breaking news to tell you about out of New York. There's a
fire burning in the World Trade Center right now. We're just hearing about that right now.
Afterwards, I wanted to do something to help. Eventually, it kind of came to me that the skills of being a lawyer translated into being able to work in the intelligence community or service in the Navy. It was a place that I really could contribute and do something towards helping after 9/11.
With a vision for her future now crystallizing, Jessica sinks herself into her studies, leaving little time for leisure.
Everything was just going really well, but going into the winter of that year, I realized that the thing that was missing in my life was a guy. What I was looking for was someone like me who was working towards an amazing future. I complained to one of my girlfriends that there just weren't any good men in the world anymore, and she laughed and said, "Oh man, do I have the guy for you." He's in the Navy, he is a doctor, he's really just intelligent and funny, and I think you would get along well with him. So I was all like, yeah, bring that on. Let's see where that could go.
It's early December when Jessica heads down to the Hard Rock Cafe in Philadelphia for a blind date with Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis.
I got there first, and when he walked in, I was honestly kind of underwhelmed. He walked in a black t-shirt and black jeans, and he was really pale. And he had this kind of weird flat top haircut. Not too flattering. I mean, not unattractive, but not attractive either. It definitely wasn't love at first sight. Jeff told me that he grew up on the West Coast. His mother ran a school. His father was a pilot. He talked a lot about how he was a flight surgeon in the Navy and his work as an emergency room doctor. There was something I found attractive about him. He was funny, but he was also arrogant. Looking back with hindsight, I think that I made excuses for that. So after the date, Jeff walked me to the train station, and there was no goodnight kiss, which was fine with me at the time. I wasn't sure even that I liked him.
And Jessica isn't sure whether Jeffrey likes her either, until she gets a call from him the following week asking for a second date.
I said, yeah, why not? I didn't have a bad time with him, so why not go out with him again? When we went out for the second time, we actually decided that we were going to get Chinese food and watch a movie at my house. So he came to my door, and before he even walked through, he said, "Hey, Chunky Butt, how are you doing?" And I just kind of looked at him, and I was like, what woman wants to be called Chunky Butt? So I actually said to him, "Hey, could you please not call me that, because it's just not cool." I was a beauty queen. Like, I spent time in a swimsuit being judged on my appearance. Being called Chunky Butt, like, at that time, it was just so not true.
It's an awkward beginning to their evening, but the tension eases up.
We set up the movie and started eating, opened a bottle of wine, and, just talked. We were having a pretty good time, and we got through most of the bottle of wine, and suddenly, I have no idea what happened. I do remember being in my kitchen and him kissing me. And that was the last thing that I remembered until the next morning. All of a sudden, he's in my bed. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I do? I totally didn't mean to do that. That wasn't on my agenda for the evening. There should have been no reason for me to black out after, let's say, half a bottle of wine. Even if I had drunk the entire bottle of wine, blacking out just isn't something that happens to me. So kind of waking up not remembering anything was strange.
That blackout period, that time she can't account for, to wake up and not know why or how somebody is still there, that unknown is very scary.
Jessica doubts herself to the point where she wonders if Jeffrey will have a bad opinion of her for sleeping with him so quickly.
But when he woke up, he told me what a great time he had last night. So I just said to myself, you know what, I might as well at this point go out with him again, since we've already gone there. And that morning we went for breakfast. And at some point it turned into a relationship that at first was really nice. He was charming. He was attentive. We talked a lot about having a future together and what that may look like. I remember we went to dinner one night in an Italian restaurant. And this restaurant had kind of an alcove where there was a table for two. No one had ever done something like that for me before. It was very romantic. So at some point, the relationship, it just worked. We were happy. I was happy with him. I was happy with where things were going. He was a good guy. And I was looking forward, into what a future might look like with him.
The relationship becomes serious, but the demands of Jeffrey's job means their time together is often disrupted.
He would frequently call me and say, all right, sorry, I got to go off and save lives. And then he would come home and tell me that, he had saved a baby or a pregnant woman or, something that would really just pull at the heartstrings, that made me feel good that I was dating this guy who really helped people.
It's been barely 2 months since they met, and Jeff goes radio silent for periods of time. Jessica becomes suspicious until one night when he tells her he has an important confession to make.
He said that he was a non-official cover agent for the CIA. He said that he had gotten special permission to tell me because I was someone who was special in his life, who he felt like he was going to have a future with, and that I needed to know and understand who he was and all of him. It's not that he wasn't an ER doctor and he wasn't a flight surgeon. He was, but they were both a cover for what he did for the CIA.
It's a little over a year since 9/11, and fighting terror is on everyone's mind.
That was a major milestone in our relationship. It was clear that he felt like I was someone he wanted to be a part of his life. In fairness, that was flattering to me that he would get special permission to share something so important, with me. There were periods of time when he would go away, that I wouldn't know where he was or where he was going. And during that time, he always said that it was because he was off fighting terrorists.
It will be years before Jessica discovers the unfathomable truth about what Jeff is really doing while undercover.
Marsalis was audacious. He was bold. He felt that he was never going to get caught.
It was just a very Jekyll and Hyde existence.
I took a sip of the drink that was mine, and I don't remember anything until I woke up the next morning. I was in his bed. I had no clothes on. He was next to me. I was very confused.
Jessica Ravel is getting deeper into a relationship with Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis, hoping that one day they'd get married and become a power couple.
He was helping people, and that was really attractive to me. We talked a lot about a future together and what that would look like with me as the lawyer, him as the doctor.
In January 2002, Jessica and Jeff go to Bermuda for their first weekend getaway.
When we first landed, it was freezing, and there wasn't anyone around. We got to the hotel. I think that it was under construction because it was an off-season. It was not the most romantic environment for a trip.
Jeff suggests they rent a scooter. They ride out to a remote beach, but the journey is far from idyllic.
I started getting scared. Because it was dark and we were the only people there, I told him that I wanted to go back, and he told me no, and he just kept driving. He was swerving the scooter in a way that felt dangerous to me. He was laughing in a way that just felt incredibly unhinged. And I remember just crying and telling him I wanted to go back, and he was like, "What do you think, I'm gonna kill you?" "I'm afraid. I want to go back. You're not wanting to take me back, and that's just scary."
This could be a test on Jeffrey's behalf of scaring her, but then showing her that nothing's going to happen and he is her protector.
Finally, Jeff climbs on the scooter and they ride back to the hotel.
By the time we got back to the hotel, I was just a total mess. I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want to be there. And it was one of those situations in which he started telling me, "You're going to have to learn to have my sort of sense of humor."
Jeff's strange mood continues, and he seems intent on baiting Jessica.
He proceeded to tell me about a time that he and his friend, who was also in the CIA, saw two guys coming out of the club, and they thought, let's pick a fight. So they picked a fight with the guys.
And this is when Jeff drops a bombshell.
He ended up killing one of them, and his friend put the other one in the hospital. He told me that when the police came, he basically showed them his CIA card and he got right out of it. That should have been a moment that was just a huge red flag. And I know it sounds probably ridiculous, but he had a way of normalizing things that were just ridiculous and horrible. This is an example of something that I've done with one of my friends. And if you can't appreciate that, then we're not going to be able to have a future together. He had this training, and sometimes instinct just took him somewhere that, normal people don't go. I think that I rationalized that it was part of what he did as part of the CIA.
On another trip, Jeff's vanity is on full display.
We went on this Disney cruise, and then we spent a couple of days in Florida. Jeff was obsessed with taking pictures of him in different settings and different poses and different states of dress. He got really dramatic with the way that he posed. He would, kind of put his head back and smile. And I just found it really strange that he was so obsessed with having these pictures of himself. The one thing that he did express interest in was becoming an astronaut. We then go to Cape Canaveral, where he decides that he needs a picture of himself in an astronaut costume. I remember asking him, well, why do you need to do that if you're going to go to astronaut training? He was like, well, it's just a fun thing to do. After we were done with the photo session, he was very excited about the picture. He actually gave it to me as a gift.
On their first Valentine's Day in 2002, Jeff tells Jessica he wants to show her where he works.
Jeff said he had something really special planned for us, and we went from his apartment to the hospital. He seemed to have access to everywhere. He then proceeded to take me to the cadaver lab. He opened drawers with dead people, showed me different organs, and suddenly he ripped off the guy's arm and then chased me around the cadaver lab with it while he laughed maniacally. I was terrified, and he told me it wasn't a big deal. He asked me why I thought it was such a big deal.
When they return to his apartment, Jessica is furious.
I remember grabbing my bag and just telling him I was leaving, and he blocked the door. He wouldn't allow me to leave. It was just one of the first times I saw behind the mask.
Despite this deeply disturbing incident, Jessica and Jeff continue to see each other. And in the summer of 2003, Jessica graduates from Rutgers Law School.
I took time and did some research into where I might want to be. I ultimately ended up enlisting in the Navy as an intelligence specialist.
Over the next year, Jessica launches her new career as Jeff continues to serve the Navy and CIA in his undercover capacity.
He would be going off on what he called missions. He's playing me recordings of what he says are him interrogating terrorists in Afghanistan, and all I hear is screaming. He played those things for me pretty regularly. I was 24, 25, and at that age, I didn't have a lot of experience with the world. It seemed like, oh my gosh, I knew what the CIA was from movies and TV, and what he was telling me made sense.
Jessica thinks the pressure of Jeff's work or some unknown stressor is making him increasingly controlling.
He started isolating me from my friends, getting me to a point where I needed to rely on him for comfort, for friendship, because I just didn't have anyone else. Either I stopped talking to them or my life was just getting too crazy with him and they stopped talking to me. I came to think that this was just my life and something that I needed to deal with, because if I didn't, people were going to get hurt. He talked about killing people, so there was definitely a part of me that was quite sure he was capable of doing that to me or people I loved.
Jessica becomes scared in her relationship.
I just started looking for coping mechanisms. I would literally go to the gym and do an aerobics class and then run 10 miles a night. So I had an excuse to not be near him. I trained for a marathon so that I wouldn't be able to see him on weekends because I was just afraid.
After more than 2 years of dating, Jeff pops the question in April 2004.
You would think getting engaged is supposed to be this happy, exciting thing. But by the time that, he brought it up, I was already in that state of terror and fear that I didn't ever think I was going to get away from him. So I said, okay. And that was it.
But unbeknownst to Jessica, Jeff is leading a sinister double life.
I totally lost my 20s to this horrible, horrible person. And they're not something that I can ever get back.
After their engagement, Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis asks fiancée Jessica Rovell to accompany him on a trip out west.
His dad was his idol, so it was just a really big deal that I was going out to Park City, Utah to meet his dad. We went skiing, we went shopping. From what I recall, we did a lot of nice things on that trip. Seeing the normalcy of the family really made me question, where did he come from? Because they were just so kind and welcoming.
But it remains a stark contrast to Jeff's disturbing and frenetic energy.
He busts open the drawer and just starts screaming at me. He's got a shotgun and he's pointing it at me and he's just screaming, "I'm gonna kill you." When he was done screaming, he took a pause and he looked at me and said, "Just kidding," and turned around and pranced out of the bathroom. I think at that point, I was just so broken down. I let it go as one of those things that I needed to deal with in my life.
Back in Philadelphia, Jeff's abusive behavior continues.
I remember being on the phone with him, and I didn't care if he killed me. I didn't care if I lived. I just couldn't deal with him anymore. And something just, clicked in my head. And I said, I can't do this anymore. And I hung up on him, and I immediately called 911 and said I needed help. I needed help. And as they were sending police over, I called my mom and I told her everything that was happening. And, it was kind of one of those, why didn't you tell us moments?
The police arrive and escort Jessica safely downtown to file a temporary restraining order.
It could have gone the wrong way any number of times. Handling it the way I did actually may have saved my life.
Soon, Jessica will learn that she is not alone, because Jeff's undercover work for the Navy and CIA has been a cover for something completely different.
It was March of 2004 when I began communicating with Jeffrey Marsalis. It was a time in my life where I was interested in getting married and having children.
Joanne Bottaro Cooper is single with a successful career in marketing when she decides to give online dating a try.
Jeffrey Marsalis's profile looked like he was a good catch. He had pictures of him in his medical scrubs with an astronaut's uniform. He had a lot of other pictures. Jeffrey said that he wanted to meet me out for a date, and I said yes. I lived in New Jersey, so he planned for me to come into Philly.
They go to a popular Irish bar in Philadelphia, the Tur Na Nog, where he describes his thriving career as an astronaut.
I was excited because he actually looked like his profile. As we were chatting and sat down at the bar, he started describing his residency program and the NASA program, and I was interested. He was interesting. He lived in a high-rise apartment building in the city that was also just a few blocks from where we were. So we went down to his apartment. He asked if I wanted a drink. I said no to an alcoholic drink. So I just wanted something non-alcoholic, whether it be water or soda. I sat down on the couch. We started to talk a little bit. He did kiss me. I then took a sip of the drink that was mine. And I don't remember anything until I woke up the next morning. I was in his bed. I had no clothes on. He was next to me. My head hurt. Every part of me hurt. I was violently ill. I knew I had sex with him. There was no question. But I didn't know why, because I had no intentions of staying over in his apartment, of having sex with him. I blacked out for probably about 8 hours. There's nothing in between my taking the sip of the drink and then waking up the next morning. I chalked it up to maybe not having enough to eat on Friday.
When Marsalis wakes up, his reaction seems to indicate nothing is amiss.
He started chatting with me like everything was normal, like what we did was normal, and I didn't say anything to him that I didn't remember anything. I just kept it all to myself. So I had assumed that I, wanted it, and I can't really explain it. I wish I could, but I can't explain it to myself. I just figured I would just forget about it. I was just gonna put it away and move on.
Over a year after Joanne dated Jeff, Jessica gets an unexpected call from the manager of his apartment building.
She called me and said, "Hey, I think you need to call the Philadelphia SBU." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Why? What happened?" And she said, just call them.
Jessica immediately reaches out.
I remember them asking me questions, and some of them were about him dating other people, and I had no idea.
The special agents tell Jessica that Jeff is accused of raping at least 2 women while she has been engaged to him.
At first, I don't know if I was in denial. I understood what my experience was, but as they were asking me questions about what sounded like the experiences of other women, it just, gosh, I don't even know how to explain it. There came a point when I was talking with the detectives that kind of a light bulb went off, and it all kind of came together. The last couple of years of my life were basically one big date rape. I came to understand that it wasn't just me, and that was just so scary.
I have to almost laugh at that. Let's get over the profile. And eventually we're going to see me as the person who I am inside. The caring, the loving, the nurturing, the easygoing, the great guy.
In March 2005, Philadelphia's Special Victims Unit launches an investigation into Jeffrey Marsalis.
The first victim that came in said she met him on a dating website. They went out on a date. She said they had a couple drinks, went back to his apartment. She woke up with him on top of her. And then wake up the next morning, he kind of sweet talks her into like, hey, we were both drinking, we had a good time, we should go out again. And she did. But after he stopped talking to her, it was really bothering her. And she came in and made a report.
By this time, it's too late to conduct a rape kit or drug test on the victim. But police obtain a search warrant for Jeff's apartment.
The first time he's not home, so we go to the manager of the apartment complex.
When the building manager reads the search warrant, she is visibly distressed.
You could see the blood just like go like this, just go right off her face. And we looked at her, she says, he did the same thing to me. We went to search his apartment. Screensaver had CIA on it. He had a bulletproof vest there. He had a doctor's coat with his name on it.
They also find what appear to be classified CIA documents, all of which are later determined to be forgeries.
Mr. Marsalis was very good and very committed to pretending to be a doctor. And he convinced other doctors, other patients, other people in the hospital that he was Dr. Marsalis. He came from tremendous privilege. He was given the opportunity to go to a number of great schools, but by the time we encountered him, he was a nursing school dropout who went around lying about who he was and victimizing women. What we found on his computer was a list that he kept. He called it the Yearly Calendar of Women, and that contained the first names of a number of women he had had sexual intercourse with.
They found a list of about 50 women.
We were shocked to learn that it wasn't 2 people who were raped by Marsalis or 3 or 4, but it was many, many women who were all victimized in the same way.
One of the names on the list is Joanne Bottaro Cooper.
Someone who worked for the assistant district attorney started to ask me if I knew Jeffrey Marsalis. She explained to me why they were calling me and what he was being investigated for. And at that moment, I had a flood of emotions. Everything that didn't make sense to me back in March of '04 came at me hard. I hung up the phone and I ran into the bathroom and I had an emotional breakdown.
Jeffrey Marsalis is arrested in April 2005, but makes bail and flees to his mother's condo in Utah. Jessica, Joanne, and a group of other victims work with police to prepare for trial.
We came up with a plan between the Philadelphia police detectives and FBI agents. Some of the victims were local, some were in the surrounding counties, some were in other states, and we started to slowly interview all of those individuals.
It becomes evident that none of the witnesses reported the rapes to police in a timely enough manner to conduct drug tests or a rape kit.
The investigation never identified the actual drug that he used. I think the strength of this case was the volume of victims who did not know one another, but yet their stories all were very similar.
The prosecutor chooses the 3 cases he will present at the trial.
I was a witness. They called me the glue that brought everything together. Because he was doing all of this while we were together, I was the baseline, the patient 0. He started with me and then just continued with these other women. We're all professional, successful women, just confident. And his mother is a strong woman, an educated woman, a confident woman, a successful woman. And it always struck me as bizarre that he chose his victims almost in the image of his mother.
The victims were very brave for being willing to share their story with the jury. Marsalis' defense attorney told the jury that the victims were lying and that this was all some kind of misunderstanding and that Marsalis was the real victim. Marsalis looked very smug and confident.
Their strategy was, he's a liar, he's not a doctor, he's not the things that he said he was, but he's not a rapist. These were women who were looking for, you know, Prince Charming, and he's not that, so they're upset, and you know, they conspired together because they had seen him again and they had a consensual relationship that presented a challenge to get a successful prosecution.
In a controversial ABC interview with Marsalis, he reacts to their accusations of him lying about his profession.
The truth is simple. We had a great time. Had consensual sex numerous times with one another. If I'm such a god-awful person, why do you keep on hanging out with me for?
He's extremely excited by it, but he's excited by it because he is gaining control over somebody who he shouldn't be able to get control over. They shouldn't be easy targets. And so therefore, by going after them, he has gained control, and that level of control thrills him, excites him, and just pushes him to do it again and again and again.
At the trial, the defense lawyers adopt a familiar tactic, victim blaming.
What were you wearing? Why did you sleep with him? You know, why did you sleep with him again? Why did you go out with him again? So it becomes more a focus on the victim's morality, if you will, than it does about the individual, the accused's culpability in the situation. In Pennsylvania at the time, there was no mechanism for there to be psychological testimony as to why rape victims act the way they do in the wake of a sexual assault. And that was problematic because with the jury, the actions that a person takes afterwards are not always what you would expect.
While the jury takes 5 days to deliberate, the victims hold their collective breath.
The result came in, and it was an acquittal.
Let me make something very, very clear to you. I have never drugged anybody. I have never raped anybody. I've never forced myself on anybody, ever.
It was difficult to hear the verdict of not guilty with respect to those 3 women. What Marsalis didn't expect, what caused the smug look on his face to disappear, was when he was arrested in the courtroom for what was going to be a second trial with 7 different women presenting their story to a jury.
After his acquittal and rearrest, victims continue to come forward, and Jeff becomes the focus of a new investigation. But hidden from the proceedings, just 2 weeks prior to the Philadelphia trial, Jeff is living in Sun Valley, Idaho.
His family had some affiliation with this resort, and he got a job there as a security guard.
It's there in October 2005 that Marsalis and a female coworker share a few drinks after work. When she's suddenly unable to walk, he puts her in a taxi and takes her back to his place to repeat a familiar scenario. But this time, Jeff's tried and true technique backfires.
She was a lesbian, and she knew that she was not going to be sleeping with a man. So she knew that she woke up and it wasn't right.
She was not confused about what happened to her. And so because she went to the police right away, the detectives were able to get a rape kit, to get physical evidence proving what had happened. They were able to talk to the bartender who talked about the drinks that were served. They were able to find witnesses who had seen her being dragged out of a taxi cab by Marsalis. This was exactly the kind of evidence that we did not have in Pennsylvania because the victim came forward right away.
Now, with another trial pending in Idaho, Philadelphia law enforcement take Jeffrey Marsalis to trial for the second time in May 2007. The case focuses on 7 women, bringing a total of 66 charges, including rape.
One of the women lived in his building, and a woman who had met Marsalis on a date after coming into Philadelphia from New Jersey.
That woman is Joanne Butaro Cooper.
I gave my testimony, and I got to stare him straight in the face and point at him and accuse him of the crimes he committed against me. That felt very empowering. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. He saw me there, and his face dropped. It felt really good to know that someone could scare him a little bit still.
After deliberating a week, the jury finds Marsalis guilty on 2 counts of sexual assault and impersonating a government official, but without physical evidence, acquits him of all other charges.
They found him guilty of sexually assaulting 2 women.
I was surprised that the jury did not see the truth and that he wasn't convicted on all counts.
He's a felon now, and he will always have to register as a sex offender.
With Jeff finally behind bars, Jessica begins the difficult task of rebuilding her life.
With every moment that you are moving forward and putting it further in your rear view, I look at my own life, and there are some tough years. It's not something that you ever forget. Certainly, it's always there. It's possible to get to a point that it's not the sole influence in your life.
Despite not being found guilty of rape, Marsalis is given a new moniker in the press, the Match.com rapist. It's not until April 2009 that the Idaho case goes to trial.
The jury heard that Marsalis denied having had any kind of intercourse with the victim, and yet a rape kit that was performed showed that he was a liar.
I felt like she was the strongest. She did what all of us hadn't done.
As Jeff enters the court for sentencing, he notices Jessica sitting in the gallery.
He thought he was being smug and he was getting to me. But at the end of the day, my being able to look back at him and, really just signal to him what a dirtbag he is was satisfying and an opportunity to just take my power back, and I did.
After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Marsalis guilty of rape.
When it comes to sentencing, the judge is able to take the dozens of cases from Pennsylvania into account.
The outcome of the 3rd trial was the most satisfying of all of them.
I will sentence you to a term of life imprisonment in the Idaho State Penitentiary.
Jeffrey Marsalis is declared a sexually violent predator.
It was the moment in which I knew that it wasn't wrong. I knew that it was not real. And I'm glad I went to Idaho, because I don't know whether I'd have gotten that closure otherwise.
I questioned myself instead of him, and I will never do that again. And I will make sure that I can speak out and tell women that you should always believe yourself first.
Joanne starts a rape crisis counseling organization, and eventually, through a mutual friend, reconnects with an old boyfriend from college.
I've been married for 3.5 years. I'm extremely happy in my job. I work for a nonprofit, and I just continue to do things that make me happy.
Without the bravery of all the survivors in this case, he'd still be out there doing it.
Jeffrey Marsalis is, in fact, one of the worst serial rapists in Pennsylvania's history.
After the Marsalis case, rape trials in Pennsylvania will never be the same.
When victim after victim shared the same story, and Marsalis was still acquitted of rape, the Pennsylvania legislature responded by changing the law, which allowed expert testimony to come into rape cases so that jurors could better understand the psychology and behavior of rape victims.
I want to let others know that this is not going to define you for the rest of your lives. This is a moment in time, and it sucks. Like, it really, truly sucks. But you get past it.
Jessica goes on to become an intelligence officer in the Navy and spends 20 years working for the FBI.
I'm an investigator at Microsoft now. There are so many good things that have gone on in my life. I'm married. I have 2 amazing, silly dogs, and I've got relationships that are strong with my family, my friends. I talk with universities, with businesses, with government agencies. I want people to know you're not alone. You're not alone. And no matter what you think has been taken away from you, you have the power to grab it back.
The August sun hung over Ferguson like a heavy curtain, pressing warm air down onto quiet streets that looked almost frozen beneath the noon light. Apartment buildings stood motionless behind rows of parked cars. Sidewalks shimmered beneath the heat. Lawn sprinklers clicked in distant yards while the ordinary rhythm of a suburban Saturday drifted through neighborhoods where children had spent years chasing bicycles, families gathered for weekend cookouts, and neighbors recognized one another from front porches rather than headlines. Nothing about that morning appeared destined to become a chapter in American history. Within a matter of minutes, however, the ordinary would disappear forever. A young man only 18 years old would lie motionless on a residential street beneath the unforgiving summer sky. His body would remain there for hours as neighbors gathered behind yellow police tape, staring in disbelief at a scene that seemed impossible to understand. Mothers would hold their children close. Fathers would shake their heads in silence. Cell phones would rise above the growing crowd, capturing images that would spread far beyond Missouri before the afternoon had even ended. Long before investigators finished collecting evidence, before lawyers argued over forensic reports, before television commentators divided into opposing camps, before politicians arrived with carefully prepared statements, the photographs had already begun shaping public memory. One body. One police officer. One neighborhood. The consequences would ripple across an entire nation. The name Ferguson would soon become more than a place on a map. It would become a symbol. To some, it represented a tragedy born from a violent confrontation that escalated in seconds. To others, it exposed wounds that had existed for generations beneath the surface of American society. Every new witness statement, every leaked document, every official report, and every courtroom decision would deepen the divide rather than erase it. Years later, people would still argue over what happened during those final moments. Some believed the shooting was an unavoidable act of self-defense. Others believed it represented a devastating failure of policing and justice. Between those opposing conclusions stood thousands of pages of investigative reports, forensic examinations, witness interviews, and legal findings that never fully erased the uncertainty surrounding those few chaotic seconds. The questions refused to disappear. What exactly happened beside that police vehicle? Why did the encounter escalate so quickly? Could anyone have prevented what followed? How did one confrontation transform into one of the most influential events in modern American history? Those questions have echoed for more than a decade, and they continue to shape conversations about race, policing, accountability, and justice throughout the United States. Yet before Ferguson became a movement, before marches filled city streets from New York to Los Angeles, before the phrase Black Lives Matter became known around the world, there was simply another hot Saturday morning and an 18-year-old who had recently celebrated finishing high school. History often feels inevitable when viewed through hindsight. Reality is rarely that simple. On the morning of August 9, 2014, nobody walking through Ferguson could have imagined that international news crews would soon descend upon their community. Nobody expected armored vehicles to roll through residential streets. Nobody believed their neighborhood would become the backdrop for weeks of demonstrations, unrest, and televised confrontations watched by millions around the globe. The transformation began almost invisibly. A patrol vehicle moved slowly through the neighborhood. 2 young men walked down the middle of a street. Words were exchanged. Seconds passed. Then came gunfire. Everything afterward would depend on memory. Memory can be powerful. Memory can also become fragile under fear, confusion, and trauma. Some witnesses described one sequence of events. Others remembered something entirely different. Physical evidence answered certain questions while leaving others unresolved. Even official investigations conducted months later could not eliminate every contradiction. That uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the entire case. As emotions spread across Ferguson, facts often struggled to keep pace with public outrage. Social media accelerated every rumor before investigators could confirm or reject it. Television networks broadcast live from streets filled with protesters and heavily armed officers. Every photograph seemed to demand an immediate conclusion, even while detectives continued gathering evidence behind closed doors. For the Brown family, however, national debates meant little compared to the overwhelming reality unfolding before them. Their son was gone. No legal argument could reverse that fact. No political speech could soften that loss. No investigation, regardless of its findings, could restore the future that had vanished in the middle of a quiet residential street. Meanwhile, Officer Darren Wilson found himself at the center of an international controversy unlike anything he could have anticipated when he began his shift that Saturday morning. His name quickly became known across America, attached to endless headlines, demonstrations, interviews, and legal scrutiny. Every aspect of his professional history would be examined. Every decision he made during those critical moments would be dissected repeatedly by investigators, prosecutors, journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens. The case soon expanded far beyond two individuals. Entire institutions came under examination. Questions emerged regarding police training. Questions emerged regarding racial disparities. Questions emerged regarding municipal courts, traffic fines, and decades of mistrust between local government and predominantly black communities. The shooting itself occupied only seconds. Its consequences would last for years. As helicopters circled overhead and news cameras arrived from across the country, Ferguson became something entirely different from the place residents had known. Streets once associated with school buses and neighborhood gatherings became recognizable to millions who had never set foot in Missouri. Apartment complexes transformed into internationally recognized landmarks. Candlelight vigils stood alongside shattered storefronts. Peaceful demonstrations sometimes gave way to nights filled with smoke, broken glass, and confrontation. Each image seemed to tell its own version of the story. Flowers placed beside the roadway. Police officers wearing tactical gear. Young protesters raising handmade signs. National Guard vehicles. Church leaders praying in crowded streets. Parents wiping tears from their faces. None of those images existed in isolation. Each represented a different piece of a larger story that could never be reduced to a single photograph. For investigators, the task remained painfully straightforward in theory and impossibly complicated in practice. Separate fact from assumption. Confirm evidence. Evaluate witness testimony. Analyze forensic findings. Determine whether criminal charges were justified. But the nation watching Ferguson expected something greater than technical conclusions. People wanted certainty. Certainty rarely exists in cases surrounded by trauma, conflicting testimony, and intense public pressure. Months later, a grand jury would hear extensive evidence before reaching its decision. Federal investigators would conduct an independent civil rights investigation. The Department of Justice would publish reports examining not only the shooting itself but broader patterns within the Ferguson Police Department. Some readers focused on one report. Others focused on another. Different conclusions reinforced different beliefs. Rather than ending the debate, each official finding became another chapter in an already deeply divided national conversation. Even today, discussions surrounding Michael Brown often begin with conclusions instead of questions. Supporters of different viewpoints frequently emphasize different evidence. Some point toward forensic analysis. Others emphasize eyewitness accounts. Some focus on legal standards governing police use of force. Others focus on historical patterns of unequal treatment. Understanding the case requires acknowledging that these perspectives developed from overlapping realities rather than simple slogans. This is not merely the story of a shooting. It is the story of a community already carrying years of tension before one encounter forced those tensions into public view. It is the story of a family whose grief unfolded beneath the relentless attention of cameras from around the world. It is the story of investigators attempting to reconstruct seconds that would influence decades of public debate. Most importantly, it is the story of how one afternoon changed countless lives far beyond those directly involved. The echoes of Ferguson can still be heard in conversations about policing, accountability, race, and justice across America. Policies changed. Body cameras became increasingly common. Police departments faced renewed scrutiny. Communities demanded greater transparency. Trust, once broken, proved far more difficult to rebuild. But every movement begins somewhere. Every national debate begins with a single moment. Before the protests. Before the investigations. Before the courtroom decisions. Before history assigned meaning to the name Ferguson. There was only an 18-year-old named Michael Brown, a police officer named Darren Wilson, and a stretch of sunlit pavement where two paths crossed for less than a minute, leaving behind questions that the United States is still trying to answer today. The city of Ferguson, Missouri, did not look like the kind of place that would one day dominate international headlines. Sitting just north of downtown St. Louis, it was neither glamorous nor particularly remarkable. From above, it appeared like countless other American suburbs, a patchwork of residential streets, apartment complexes, churches, schools, convenience stores, and narrow roads lined with aging trees that offered precious shade during the humid Midwestern summers. For decades, people moved there for ordinary reasons. Some wanted affordable housing. Others wanted to stay close to family. Many simply wanted a quiet place to build a life. Yet beneath its familiar appearance lay a community carrying years of silent tension. To an outsider driving through Ferguson in the summer of 2014, nothing immediately suggested that the city stood at the edge of a national reckoning. Children laughed on playgrounds. School buses followed their regular routes during the academic year. Local businesses opened every morning, serving coffee to commuters and groceries to neighborhood families. Elderly residents swept their front porches before the heat of the afternoon settled over the streets. It looked peaceful. But appearances often conceal histories that cannot be seen from a passing car. Ferguson had changed dramatically over the previous several decades. During the latter half of the 20th century, many white families had gradually moved farther into suburban developments beyond St. Louis, while black families increasingly settled in Ferguson, attracted by relatively affordable housing and opportunities to own homes. The city's demographics shifted faster than its political institutions. By 2014, nearly 70% of Ferguson's residents were African American, yet many positions of power within the city's government, police department, and municipal court system remained overwhelmingly white. Numbers alone never tell the whole story. The deeper issue was trust. Or rather, the absence of it. For many black residents, encounters with local law enforcement had become an expected source of anxiety rather than reassurance. Traffic stops were common. Municipal citations accumulated quickly. Small infractions often led to fines that many struggling families found difficult to pay. Missing a court appearance could trigger additional penalties. Those additional penalties frequently created even greater financial burdens. To city officials, these practices were part of maintaining public order and generating municipal revenue. To many residents, they felt like an endless cycle from which there was no easy escape. Long before August 2014, conversations in barbershops, churches, living rooms, and neighborhood gatherings often returned to similar experiences. Someone had been stopped for a broken taillight. Someone else had received another citation. Another family worried about mounting court fees. Individually, each incident seemed relatively minor. Together, they slowly eroded confidence in the institutions that were supposed to serve the community. Most of these conversations never reached newspaper headlines. They remained local stories. Stories shared between neighbors. Stories repeated across generations. Stories that accumulated quietly until one day they would collide with national attention. The Ferguson Police Department consisted of officers performing the difficult work expected of law enforcement in communities across America. Many officers believed they were protecting neighborhoods, responding to crimes, and enforcing laws fairly. Others, however, acknowledged privately that relationships between officers and residents had become increasingly strained. Neither side viewed the other through a lens of complete trust. Every interaction carried invisible baggage. Every encounter was shaped not only by the people standing face to face but also by years of previous experiences. Against this backdrop lived an 18-year-old named Michael Orlandus Brown Jr. To his family, he was not a symbol. He was simply Michael. His grandmother remembered his laughter long before strangers learned his name. His mother remembered holding him as a baby, watching him grow from an energetic child into an unusually tall teenager whose physical size often made him appear older than he truly was. Friends joked about his height. Teachers remembered him as someone who could be quiet one moment and animated the next. Like many young men standing at the threshold between adolescence and adulthood, he was still figuring out who he wanted to become. Life had not always been simple. His parents' relationship had faced challenges over the years, and like many families balancing work, finances, and personal struggles, stability sometimes required sacrifice. Yet despite hardships, Michael remained surrounded by relatives who believed he had a future worth building. Only days before August 9th, he had crossed one of the first major milestones of adulthood. He had graduated from Normandy High School. The ceremony had been more than another school event. For his family, it represented possibility. Graduation photographs captured smiles filled with optimism. There were conversations about employment, education, and responsibility. Plans were beginning to take shape. Michael intended to enroll at Vatterett College to study heating and air conditioning technology, a practical trade that promised steady employment. It was not a glamorous dream. It was a realistic one. The kind of dream shared by countless American families who hoped education could become the bridge toward financial stability. Friends described Michael in different ways, depending on which version of him they knew best. Some remembered a playful teenager who enjoyed making people laugh. Others remembered someone capable of stubbornness, someone who occasionally acted impulsively without fully considering the consequences. He could be loud. He could also become unexpectedly quiet. He enjoyed spending time with friends around the neighborhood, listening to music, talking about sports, joking about everyday life, and imagining the future in broad, uncomplicated terms. He was 18. At 18, the future often feels limitless because its boundaries remain invisible. No one expects time to run out before adulthood truly begins. On the other side of the story stood Officer Darren Wilson. At 28 years old, Wilson had served with the Ferguson Police Department for approximately 6 years. He had chosen a profession that demanded quick decisions under uncertain circumstances, where routine patrols could shift into dangerous situations within seconds. Police work often exists in contradiction. Hours of monotony are interrupted by moments requiring immediate judgment. Officers spend much of their careers responding to calls they have never encountered before, making decisions with incomplete information while knowing those decisions may later be examined frame by frame in courtrooms or public opinion. Wilson's colleagues generally described him as a reserved officer. He was not known nationally. He had no expectation that his name would ever become recognizable beyond his own department. Like countless officers beginning another weekend shift, he climbed into his patrol vehicle expecting another ordinary day. There were no body cameras attached to his uniform. In 2014, body-worn cameras were still far from standard equipment across many American police departments. Dashboard cameras existed in some patrol vehicles, but they did not capture every interaction. Much of what occurred during police encounters still depended on human memory. Memory can illuminate. Memory can also conflict. That reality would soon become central to everything that followed. As August settled over Missouri, summer reached one of its hottest stretches. The air carried the familiar heaviness that Midwestern residents knew well. Heat rose from asphalt streets in shimmering waves. Cicadas filled trees with their constant mechanical chorus. Clouds drifted slowly across pale blue skies, offering little relief from temperatures climbing toward the upper 80s. Saturday mornings possessed their own rhythm. Parents completed errands before afternoon heat intensified. Children played basketball in neighborhood parks. Residents visited convenience stores for drinks, snacks, or lottery tickets. Traffic remained relatively light. The pace felt unhurried. Nothing suggested that within hours helicopters would circle overhead broadcasting live images to the world. Inside apartments scattered throughout Ferguson, families followed routines developed over years. Breakfast dishes waited beside kitchen sinks. Televisions played quietly in living rooms. Laundry tumbled inside washing machines. Phones buzzed with ordinary conversations about weekend plans. Michael Brown's day began much like countless Saturdays before it. There was no indication that history waited just beyond noon. No farewell carried unusual weight. No ordinary conversation hinted that it would become the final one. Across town, Officer Wilson continued his patrol responsibilities. Responding to suspicious activity. Monitoring neighborhood traffic. Driving streets he had likely traveled hundreds of times before. Neither man knew the other. Neither could imagine that before the afternoon ended their names would become permanently linked in American history. Communities rarely recognize the exact moment before everything changes. Transformation usually announces itself only in retrospect. Looking backward, people identify crossroads that seemed invisible at the time. One decision. One encounter. One unexpected turn. History often compresses events into neat timelines. Reality unfolds far more slowly. On the morning of August 9th, Ferguson remained simply Ferguson. Residents worried about rent payments, job interviews, family illnesses, and grocery bills. Teenagers thought about weekend plans. Church volunteers prepared for Sunday services. Store owners stocked shelves. Delivery trucks completed routine routes. Life moved forward with comforting predictability. No television crews occupied street corners. No national commentators debated policing strategies. No protesters marched through neighborhoods carrying signs. Those scenes belonged to a future nobody could yet imagine. Yet beneath the ordinary surface, countless unseen threads were already moving toward one another. A convenience store. A patrol vehicle. Two young men walking along a residential street. A police officer performing routine patrol. A neighborhood carrying years of unresolved tension. A nation increasingly debating race, policing, and justice after several other controversial incidents involving law enforcement. Each thread appeared separate. Within the next hour, they would become inseparable. The confrontation itself would last only moments. Its consequences would outlive everyone involved. As the sun climbed higher over Ferguson and the morning slowly surrendered to noon, the city continued breathing in its familiar rhythm, unaware that it was approaching the final minutes of anonymity. By the time the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Ferguson would no longer be known merely as another suburb outside St. Louis. It would become the place where one encounter forced America to confront questions it had been postponing for generations. And everything would begin with what appeared, at first glance, to be nothing more than another ordinary Saturday morning. Michael Orlandis Brown Jr. had only been an adult for a few months. Legally, he had crossed that invisible line separating childhood from adulthood on paper. In reality, like countless 18-year-olds, he still lived in the uncertain space between dependence and independence, where dreams were larger than experience and tomorrow always seemed guaranteed. To understand why his death resonated so deeply across the United States, it is necessary to step away from the courtroom documents, forensic reports, and political debates. Before he became the center of one of the most controversial police shootings in modern American history, Michael Brown was simply a son, a grandson, a friend, and a young man trying to figure out what adulthood might look like. His story did not begin on Camfield Drive. It began 18 years earlier. Michael was born on May 20, 1996, in the greater St. Louis area, a region where neighborhoods often reflected both opportunity and inequality at the same time. His family experienced many of the same challenges faced by working-class American households. Bills had to be paid. Jobs changed. Relationships evolved. Like millions of families, they celebrated birthdays, argued over small things, gathered for holidays, and hoped each new year would be a little easier than the last. From the beginning, Michael stood out for one reason everyone noticed immediately. He was big. As a child, he grew quickly, towering over classmates long before reaching high school. Relatives often laughed that strangers assumed he was older than he really was. Teachers sometimes expected greater maturity simply because of his size. Coaches imagined athletic potential. Store clerks occasionally looked twice before asking his age. His height became part of his identity. By the time he reached his late teens, he stood over 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds. His broad shoulders and imposing frame made him impossible to overlook. Yet those closest to him often described a different person from the one strangers imagined after seeing his physical appearance. His grandmother remembered a boy who enjoyed making people smile. Family members recalled his habit of giving unexpectedly warm hugs despite his enormous size. Young cousins looked up to him, not only because he was physically taller but because he naturally slipped into the role of older brother during family gatherings. He was protective. Sometimes overly protective. If he believed someone close to him had been treated unfairly, he could become emotional very quickly. That intensity occasionally led to arguments, but it also reflected a personality that cared deeply about the people around him. Friends knew another version of Michael. To them, he loved joking around. He enjoyed music filling the background while conversations drifted from basketball to video games, from girls to future plans. Like many teenagers, he could spend hours talking without any real destination, simply enjoying the company of people who understood him. He laughed loudly. He teased constantly. He sometimes acted before thinking. None of those qualities made him unusual. They made him 18. Teachers who encountered him during high school remembered someone whose academic performance varied. There were days he appeared engaged and motivated. Other days, he seemed distracted, carrying the restlessness common among students already looking beyond graduation. School was rarely easy for him. Not because he lacked intelligence, but because concentration competed with the realities of growing up in an environment where economic uncertainty often overshadowed long-term planning. Many teenagers dream about becoming athletes, musicians, or celebrities. Michael's ambitions were more practical. He wanted stability. He had recently completed high school at Normandy High School, an achievement that carried enormous significance within his family. Graduation represented more than receiving a diploma. It symbolized persistence. It suggested that another chapter could finally begin. Photographs taken during those celebrations captured genuine optimism. He smiled broadly beneath his graduation cap. Relatives stood proudly beside him. The future appeared open. Conversations soon shifted toward what came next. Michael planned to attend Vaterett College, where he intended to study heating, ventilation, and air conditioning technology. VAC work was not glamorous, but it offered something many families valued above everything else. Reliable employment. A steady paycheck. An honest profession. People close to him believed he could build a comfortable life through skilled trade work. He spoke occasionally about wanting financial independence, about helping family members, about becoming someone younger relatives could admire. They were ordinary dreams. Ordinary dreams often carry extraordinary importance. No parent raises a child hoping they become famous because of tragedy. His mother, Leslie McSpadden, later described the pride she felt watching her son graduate. Like many parents, she believed the difficult years of adolescence were slowly giving way to adulthood. There would be mistakes ahead. There always are. But there would also be opportunities. No one imagined that the graduation photographs would become some of the last images showing Michael alive. Those pictures would soon appear on television broadcasts around the world. Friends remembered spending time with Michael during that final summer before college. There were long afternoons hanging around apartment complexes. Trips to neighborhood stores. Casual conversations stretching late into the evening. Plans that never required calendars because 18-year-olds often believe there will always be another weekend. He enjoyed ordinary things. Listening to music through headphones while walking. Watching basketball. Laughing about internet videos. Talking with friends about girls and future jobs. Nothing about those activities hinted that his name would one day appear in history books. Like many teenagers, Michael occasionally made poor decisions. His family never pretended otherwise. He could become stubborn during disagreements. He sometimes reacted emotionally instead of calmly. He occasionally ignored advice offered by older relatives who believed they understood life better than he did. Those imperfections mattered because they made him human. True crime stories often divide people into heroes and villains. Reality almost never works that way. Human beings are complicated. They possess strengths and weaknesses simultaneously. Michael Brown was no exception. On the morning of August 9, 2014, he woke without any reason to believe the day would become his last. Summer vacation still lingered before college classes would begin. The weather forecast promised another warm Missouri afternoon. Nothing extraordinary appeared on the schedule. He met his friend Dorian Johnson. The two young men spent part of the morning together, talking as friends often do, without urgency or careful planning. No cameras followed them. No reporters observed them. No investigators knew they existed. At that moment, they were simply two teenagers walking through their own neighborhood. Later that morning, events unfolded inside a nearby convenience store. Security cameras recorded Michael Brown taking a box of cigars without paying and becoming involved in a confrontation with a store employee. That footage would later become one of the most widely discussed pieces of evidence in the entire case. It also became one of the most controversial. Some argued it revealed aspects of Brown's behavior shortly before the fatal encounter. Others argued it unfairly shifted public attention toward an incident unrelated to the legal question of whether deadly force was justified minutes later. Both perspectives would continue fueling debate for years. What remains important is chronology. The convenience store encounter occurred before Officer Darren Wilson encountered Michael Brown and Dorian Johnson. At the time Wilson first saw the two young men walking down Canfield Drive, he had reportedly received information related to a theft investigation, though the precise sequence of dispatch communications became one of many details examined during later investigations. For Michael, however, those next few minutes likely felt ordinary. There is no evidence suggesting he believed he was approaching the defining moment of his life. Young people rarely anticipate disaster. They think in hours rather than consequences. They focus on lunch instead of history. As Michael and Dorian continued walking along the residential street, the neighborhood around them remained remarkably calm. Apartment buildings stood beneath the afternoon sun. Residents moved between homes and parked vehicles. Children remained nearby. Nothing visually separated those moments from hundreds of previous Saturdays. History often arrives quietly. It does not announce itself. It slips into ordinary routines before anyone recognizes what is happening. Michael's physical appearance would later become an important factor throughout investigations. His height and weight were repeatedly discussed in witness testimony, forensic analysis, and legal proceedings. To some observers, his imposing size influenced perceptions of potential threat. To others, focusing heavily on his physical build risked reducing an 18-year-old human being to measurements on paper. Both realities existed simultaneously. He was undeniably a very large young man. He was also still 18 years old. The complexity of those truths would become impossible to separate once public debate began. Family members later struggled with watching strangers construct opinions about someone they believed they knew intimately. Millions of Americans who had never met Michael Brown developed strong conclusions after reading headlines, watching interviews, or viewing selected pieces of evidence. Some saw an innocent teenager. Others emphasized the convenience store incident. Still others attempted to balance both realities without reducing his entire life to either one moment or another. For those who loved him, however, none of those public arguments captured the person they remembered sitting around dinner tables, celebrating birthdays, teasing cousins, or laughing with friends. To them, Michael remained a young man whose bedroom still contained personal belongings untouched after August 9th. His shoes remained where he had left them. His clothes still hung inside the closet. His graduation memories remained painfully fresh. The future everyone had imagined only days earlier had disappeared before it could truly begin. The tragedy of youth is not merely that life ends. It is that possibility ends with it. Every conversation that never happens. Every birthday that never arrives. Every career that never begins. Every child never born. Every apology never spoken. Every reconciliation forever postponed. Those invisible losses cannot be measured through forensic reports or courtroom testimony. They exist only in the hearts of those left behind. As noon approached on that hot Missouri Saturday, Michael Brown continued walking beside his friend through Ferguson, unaware that countless strangers would someday know his name without ever knowing the ordinary young man behind it. Within minutes, his life would intersect with Officer Darren Wilson's. The encounter would last only moments. Its consequences would endure for generations. And the story that followed would no longer belong solely to Michael Brown or his family. It would become part of America's unfinished conversation about justice, race, policing, memory, and truth. The clock was approaching noon when the rhythm of the neighborhood began to shift, although no one walking through Canfield Drive could have sensed it. The Missouri sun stood high overhead, pouring heat onto the pavement until the asphalt shimmered in the distance. Apartment buildings cast short shadows across patches of dry grass. A few residents lingered near their doorways, escaping the warmth only briefly before retreating indoors. Somewhere in the background, a lawn mower hummed steadily. A dog barked behind a fence. Cars rolled slowly through nearby intersections, their drivers unaware that history was only moments away from unfolding a few streets over. For Michael Brown and his friend, Dorian Johnson, the morning had already included an incident that would later become one of the most scrutinized parts of the entire case. Minutes earlier, they had entered Ferguson Market and Liquor, a small neighborhood convenience store familiar to many local residents. Surveillance cameras inside the store captured an encounter that investigators would later examine frame by frame. According to the surveillance footage and subsequent investigative reports, Michael Brown took a package of cigars without paying. A confrontation followed between Brown and a store employee near the entrance. During the struggle, the employee attempted to block Brown from leaving, and physical contact occurred before Brown and Dorian Johnson exited the store. At the time, neither the employee nor anyone else inside the store could have imagined how dramatically those images would later shape public discussion. The footage itself would not become public immediately. Instead, it remained unseen while another event unfolded only minutes later, one that would eclipse everything that had happened inside the store. As Michael and Dorian continued walking through the neighborhood, they chose to remain in the roadway rather than using the sidewalk. It was not unusual for residents to do so on relatively quiet residential streets. Cars passed occasionally, but traffic remained light, especially on a warm Saturday afternoon. The conversation between the two friends was ordinary. There is no recording of what they discussed. Perhaps they joked. Perhaps they talked about college. Perhaps they simply enjoyed the slow pace of a summer day with nowhere urgent to be. Those final ordinary moments disappeared forever without anyone realizing their importance. Elsewhere, Officer Darren Wilson continued his patrol. 6 years into his career with the Ferguson Police Department, routine patrol had become second nature. Officers spent countless hours driving familiar streets, responding to dispatch calls, checking suspicious activity, and observing neighborhoods for anything unusual. Most encounters end with little more than brief conversations. Some become traffic citations. A handful become arrests. Very few become international news. Wilson drove along Camfield Drive in his marked police SUV. Accounts differ regarding the exact sequence of information he had received before encountering Brown and Johnson. During later investigations, dispatch recordings and testimony were carefully analyzed to reconstruct the timeline. What remains undisputed is that Wilson noticed two young men walking down the middle of the street. As his patrol vehicle approached, he addressed them. According to multiple accounts, he instructed them to move onto the sidewalk. Exactly how that conversation began remains one of many details interpreted differently over the years. What happened next unfolded rapidly. Wilson later stated that Brown and Johnson responded with profanity. Johnson acknowledged there was a verbal exchange but described portions of the interaction differently. Small differences in recollection may seem insignificant. In rapidly evolving situations, however, every second matters. Wilson pulled his patrol vehicle slightly ahead before stopping. He then began reversing toward the two young men. Residents nearby later recalled hearing raised voices but initially paid little attention. Arguments between police officers and citizens were not unheard of. Nothing yet suggested violence. The patrol vehicle came to a stop beside Brown. The driver's window remained open. What followed became the single most disputed sequence of events in the entire investigation. According to Darren Wilson's testimony, Brown approached the driver's side window. Wilson stated that an argument intensified almost immediately. He later told investigators that Brown reached inside the vehicle through the open window, struck him, and attempted to seize his service pistol. Wilson described a violent struggle taking place inside the police SUV. During that struggle, one round was fired inside the vehicle. Forensic examination later confirmed that a gunshot had indeed been discharged while Brown was near the driver's side of the SUV. Investigators also documented evidence inside the vehicle, including blood and ballistic findings consistent with a shot being fired during the encounter. What remained disputed was exactly how the struggle unfolded. Dorian Johnson offered a significantly different account of portions of the encounter. Some nearby witnesses also remembered events differently from Wilson's description. Human memory under stress is rarely identical from one observer to another. People standing only a few yards apart often remember different sequences, different words, even different positions. Investigators would spend months comparing those conflicting recollections. After the initial shot inside the vehicle, everyone agrees on one point. Michael Brown moved away from the police SUV. Beyond that moment, the narratives began separating once again. Wilson stated that Brown fled before turning back and moving toward him in a manner Wilson believed posed an immediate threat. Other witnesses described Brown slowing, stopping, or turning around under different circumstances. Several witnesses later stated they believed Brown had raised his hands. Others did not report seeing that. Still others admitted they could not clearly observe everything because buildings, vehicles, distance, or the speed of events limited their view. No single witness observed every second from the same angle. The physical evidence answered certain questions. It could not answer them all. As Brown moved farther from the vehicle, Wilson exited his SUV. The distance between the two men increased across the roadway. Residents who had previously ignored the argument now became aware that something far more serious was unfolding. Some stepped onto balconies. Others looked through apartment windows. Several froze where they stood. Then the shooting continued. Gunfire echoed through the neighborhood. One shot. Then another. Then several more. The sharp cracks bounced between apartment buildings, startling residents who instinctively ducked or looked toward the sound. Children stopped playing. Conversations ended mid-sentence. People emerged from nearby buildings, trying to understand what had just happened. Wilson ultimately fired a total of 12 rounds, according to his testimony and investigative findings. The medical examiner later concluded that Michael Brown had been struck by at least 6 bullets. The wounds included injuries to his head, chest, arm, and hand. The forensic evidence established where bullets entered the body. It could not fully reconstruct every movement made during those final seconds. Within moments, the shooting was over. Silence returned almost as suddenly as it had disappeared. Michael Brown collapsed onto the pavement of Camfield Drive. The heat remained relentless. Nothing about the weather acknowledged what had just occurred. For a brief moment, the neighborhood seemed suspended between disbelief and confusion. People stared. Some remained frozen. Others began moving cautiously toward the scene before stopping at a distance. Nobody fully understood what had happened. Only that a young man now lay motionless in the middle of the street. Emergency radio traffic intensified almost immediately. Additional officers were dispatched. Medical assistance was requested. The area began transforming from a residential neighborhood into an active crime scene. Yellow police tape would soon appear. Police vehicles arrived one after another. Officers secured the perimeter while investigators prepared to document evidence exactly as they found it. Residents quickly gathered nearby. Word traveled through apartment buildings faster than official information. Someone had been shot. A teenager. By the police. Family members searched desperately for details. Rumors spread from one person to another, growing more dramatic with each retelling. No official statement yet existed. Facts remained incomplete. Emotion filled the empty spaces where certainty had not yet arrived. Some witnesses cried openly. Others argued loudly about what they believed they had seen. Several began recording videos with their phones. Those recordings, combined with photographs taken throughout the afternoon, would become some of the most widely circulated images associated with the case. Meanwhile, investigators focused on preserving evidence. Shell casings were marked. Measurements were taken. Photographs documented every angle. Bloodstains were recorded before weather or foot traffic could alter the scene. Each detail mattered because every detail might later answer questions inside a courtroom. Yet another decision soon drew enormous public attention. Michael Brown's body remained where it had fallen. Hour after hour passed beneath the August sun. Residents watched from behind police barriers as the body stayed uncovered on the pavement for nearly 4 hours while investigators processed the scene according to standard homicide procedures. For law enforcement, preserving the integrity of the crime scene was considered essential. For many members of the community, especially Brown's family and neighbors, the prolonged presence of his body in public view became deeply traumatic. Many interpreted it as profoundly disrespectful. The emotional impact of that image cannot be separated from everything that followed. Children saw it. Neighbors saw it. Friends saw it. Eventually, the entire world saw it. Television cameras arrived. Journalists interviewed shaken residents. Photographs spread rapidly across social media before official investigators had completed their work. By late afternoon, the shooting had already escaped the boundaries of Ferguson. News organizations across the country interrupted programming. Initial reports remained cautious. Details were limited. Conflicting witness statements had already begun emerging. Questions greatly outnumbered answers. Who started the confrontation? What happened inside the police vehicle? Did Michael Brown charge toward Wilson? Was he surrendering? Why had 12 shots been fired? Could the encounter have ended differently? Investigators had only begun searching for evidence. The public, however, had already begun searching for meaning. That search would become every bit as significant as the forensic investigation itself. Because from the moment Michael Brown fell onto the pavement of Camfield Drive, the case ceased to be only about reconstructing a fatal encounter. It became a story about memory, perception, trust, and the deep fractures that already existed beneath the surface of a community. Before sunset, candles would begin appearing. Before midnight, crowds would gather. Within days, Ferguson would become the focus of the world's attention. But standing in the unbearable August heat, staring at a street that had suddenly become a crime scene, the people gathered behind the police tape understood only one undeniable fact. Their neighborhood would never be the same again. The first police sirens faded almost as quickly as they had arrived, replaced by something far more unsettling. Silence. Not complete silence, but the strained, unnatural quiet that settles over a place where something irreversible has just happened. The sound of traffic seemed more distant. Voices became whispers. Even the summer insects that had filled the afternoon air moments earlier appeared insignificant against the weight of what now lay in the middle of Camfield Drive. Officer Darren Wilson had already been removed from the immediate area. Additional Ferguson police officers arrived within minutes, followed by supervisors, crime scene investigators, emergency personnel, and detectives. Their responsibilities were immediate and procedural. Secure the scene. Protect evidence. Separate witnesses. Record every observable detail before anything could be disturbed. Every homicide investigation begins with preserving the scene exactly as investigators find it. Measurements must be taken. Photographs captured. Physical evidence documented before weather, vehicles, or curious onlookers unintentionally alter crucial details. To investigators, those procedures represented professionalism. To many residents gathering nearby, they looked painfully different. Behind the growing line of yellow police tape stood neighbors who had watched a young man collapse only minutes earlier. They did not see an organized forensic investigation. They saw Michael Brown lying motionless beneath the blazing August sun. As more people emerged from nearby apartment buildings, questions spread faster than answers. What happened? Who was shot? Is he alive? Why won't they let anyone near him? No single person possessed the complete story. Every witness had seen only part of the encounter. Some had heard the gunfire before looking outside. Others had witnessed only the final moments. Several had seen nearly everything from their windows or balconies, but from different angles. Human observation is rarely complete. Each person carries away only the portion of reality visible from where they stand. Detectives understood that immediately. Witnesses needed to be identified before memories changed. Names were collected. Telephone numbers recorded. Initial statements taken. Some witnesses appeared confident. Others admitted uncertainty. Many remained visibly shaken. Traumatic events affect perception in unpredictable ways. A person may remember a facial expression with remarkable clarity while forgetting the sequence of sounds only seconds earlier. Another may recall exact movements but misjudge distance. Investigators knew conflicting accounts were not unusual. What made this case extraordinary was the number of people who had seen portions of the incident unfold. Camfield Drive was not an isolated road. Apartment buildings overlooked the street. Residents had been home on a Saturday afternoon. Within minutes, dozens of potential witnesses existed. Their memories would become one of the most debated aspects of the entire investigation. Meanwhile, crime scene technicians moved carefully across the pavement. Bright evidence markers appeared one after another beside spent shell casings. Each brass casing represented another fired round. Each location mattered. The relative positions of those casings could help investigators estimate where Officer Darren Wilson had been standing while firing. Nearby, forensic photographers documented the patrol SUV. Particular attention focused on the driver's side door and interior of the vehicle. Investigators examined areas where Wilson stated the initial struggle had occurred. Inside the SUV, they located evidence consistent with a firearm having discharged during the confrontation. The vehicle itself became an important witness. Unlike human memory, physical evidence carries no opinion. It cannot explain intent. It cannot describe fear. But it preserves traces of what occurred. Blood evidence was carefully documented. Ballistic trajectories would later be examined. DNA samples collected. Fingerprints considered. Every scientific procedure followed protocols developed through decades of homicide investigation. Yet even the most advanced forensic science possesses limitations. Evidence can describe where. Sometimes when. Occasionally how. It rarely explains why. As investigators worked, another image was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. Michael Brown remained exactly where he had fallen. The Missouri sun continued beating down relentlessly. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then another. His body lay uncovered in the roadway while detectives continued documenting the crime scene according to standard investigative procedures. From a forensic standpoint, disturbing the body before completing measurements, photographs, and evidence collection risked compromising important information. From the perspective of Brown's family and many community members, each passing minute deepened emotional pain. Residents watched from behind police tape as someone they recognized remained exposed in public view. Some quietly cried. Others grew increasingly angry. Several later recalled feeling powerless. The distance separating investigators from the crowd was measured in yards. Emotionally, it felt immeasurable. Among those desperately seeking information were members of Michael Brown's family. News had spread rapidly through Ferguson. Phone calls interrupted ordinary Saturday routines. Someone had been shot. People believed it might be Michael. Relatives rushed toward Camfield Drive hoping the rumors were wrong. Instead, they encountered police barriers. Officers restricted access while investigators continued processing the scene. Family members were not permitted to approach the body. For many observers, those moments became among the most painful memories associated with the entire case. No parent imagines standing only a short distance from their child while unable to reach them. No family prepares for grief unfolding beneath the gaze of neighbors, strangers, and eventually international news cameras. As the afternoon progressed, journalists began arriving. Initially, local television crews responded as they would to any officer-involved shooting. Satellite trucks parked nearby. Reporters gathered preliminary information from police spokespeople and residents. Cameras recorded the growing crowd. Few realized the story would soon dominate national broadcasts. The first reports contained only limited confirmed information. An officer had shot an 18-year-old male. The circumstances remained under investigation. Witnesses described conflicting versions of events. Those careful statements quickly collided with social media. Unlike traditional journalism, online platforms demanded no verification before information spread. Photographs appeared within minutes. Short videos circulated without context. Witnesses posted personal interpretations while events were still unfolding. Rumors multiplied. Some proved accurate. Others did not. The distinction often disappeared beneath the speed of digital communication. Across Ferguson, people checked their phones repeatedly. Every refresh seemed to produce another image. Another eyewitness account. Another theory. The city was beginning to experience something relatively new in American history. A major police shooting unfolding simultaneously as millions of people consumed information through social media in real time. Public opinion formed long before official investigations concluded. In many ways, that reality would shape everything that followed. Back at the crime scene, detectives continued reconstructing the encounter. Measurements were taken between shell casings and the patrol vehicle. Distances were carefully recorded. Investigators searched nearby grass, sidewalks, and parked vehicles for additional evidence. Nothing was considered insignificant. A single fragment. A single stain. A single photograph. Each might later answer questions impossible to resolve through testimony alone. Medical personnel eventually confirmed what everyone already feared. Michael Brown had died at the scene. The medical examiner would later conduct a full autopsy, documenting multiple gunshot wounds and recovering evidence necessary for forensic analysis. Those findings would become central during subsequent legal proceedings. At the time, however, residents knew only one fact. An 18-year-old from their community was dead. As afternoon slowly turned toward evening, the crowd continued growing. Some residents arrived carrying bottled water for neighbors standing beneath the intense heat. Others brought folding chairs. Pastors appeared. Community leaders spoke quietly with grieving family members. The atmosphere shifted repeatedly between mourning and anger. People wanted explanations. Police had very few answers they were prepared to release. That information vacuum allowed speculation to flourish. Several witnesses began speaking with reporters. Descriptions varied. Some remembered Brown moving toward the officer. Others insisted he had been trying to surrender. Some recalled hearing many gunshots. Others struggled to estimate the number. These differences were expected during traumatic events. Unfortunately, they also made public understanding increasingly complicated. Detectives knew it would take weeks, perhaps months, to compare every statement against physical evidence. The public expected certainty immediately. Certainty did not exist. Not yet. As investigators photographed the final sections of the scene, another issue quietly emerged. Many residents questioned why so many heavily armed officers had arrived. Police commanders, anticipating larger crowds, requested additional personnel to maintain security around the investigation. Their presence was intended to preserve order. For some residents already distrustful of law enforcement, the growing police response appeared intimidating rather than reassuring. Perception became almost as important as reality. Every police vehicle, every uniform, every instruction shouted across the crowd. Each interaction influenced emotions that were already dangerously close to boiling over. By late afternoon, the body was finally removed from Camfield Drive. Nearly 4 hours had passed since the shooting. The street looked strangely empty. Only bloodstains, evidence markers, and police tape remained. Yet the image of Michael Brown lying beneath the summer sun had already become permanently fixed in the memories of everyone who witnessed it. No amount of time could erase that picture. No official report could replace it. It would soon travel across television screens around the world. After investigators completed their work, residents slowly approached the place where Brown had fallen. Flowers appeared first. Then candles. Stuffed animals. Handwritten notes. Someone placed a small cross nearby. Others simply stood in silence. The memorial grew almost immediately. People who had never met Michael Brown stopped to pay their respects. Some prayed quietly. Others embraced strangers. Many struggled to understand how an ordinary Saturday afternoon had transformed into a tragedy that now belonged not only to Ferguson but to the entire nation. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, the official investigation was only beginning. Laboratories would examine forensic evidence. Detectives would interview witnesses again and again. Experts would analyze ballistics, DNA, blood patterns, and medical findings. Lawyers would prepare for months of legal review. But outside the police station, another investigation had already begun. It unfolded in conversations between neighbors. In church basements. Across television studios. On social media feeds. Inside homes where parents tried to explain the day's events to frightened children. 2 parallel searches for truth had started. One would rely on forensic evidence, sworn testimony, and legal standards. The other would rely on lived experience, historical memory, and public trust. Those 2 paths would intersect repeatedly over the coming months. They would rarely arrive at the same destination. By the time the sun disappeared beyond the rooftops of Ferguson, the crime scene had been cleared. The evidence had been collected. The witnesses had begun giving statements. The official machinery of justice was moving into motion. Yet something far larger had also awakened. The death of Michael Brown was no longer only a homicide investigation. It had become the spark that threatened to ignite years of accumulated frustration, grief, suspicion, and unanswered questions. Before midnight, the first demonstrations would begin. Within days, the entire world would be watching Ferguson. The investigation officially began the moment the crime scene was secured, but in reality, 2 entirely different investigations were already unfolding. One belonged to detectives, forensic scientists, prosecutors, and federal investigators. Their task was methodical. Every decision would depend upon evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny. Every witness statement had to be compared against physical findings. Every conclusion would require documentation rather than assumption. The other investigation belonged to the public. It unfolded across sidewalks, church pews, barbershops, living rooms, radio broadcasts, cable news programs, and social media feeds. Millions of people who would never visit Ferguson began assembling their own understanding of the shooting from photographs, eyewitness interviews, leaked information, and deeply personal beliefs about policing, race, and justice. Those 2 investigations often moved at very different speeds. The public wanted answers immediately. The legal system demanded patience. Within hours of the shooting, detective from the St. Louis County Police Department assumed primary responsibility for the criminal investigation, a common practice in officer-involved shootings within the region. Their first priority was straightforward in principle but enormously difficult in practice. Reconstruct every second of the encounter. The challenge became immediately apparent. Unlike many modern police shootings, there was no body camera footage documenting the interaction. Dashboard camera recordings offered no complete account. No surveillance camera overlooked the critical moments on Camfield Drive. The case would therefore depend on three primary categories of evidence: physical evidence, witness testimony, forensic analysis. Each category would answer certain questions while leaving others unresolved. Detectives began locating everyone who might have observed any portion of the encounter. The list grew rapidly. Residents had watched from apartment balconies. Others had looked through second-story windows. Some had been walking nearby. Several heard the confrontation before turning toward the sound of gunfire. Each witness had experienced only one perspective. No one possessed a perfect view of every second. Investigators understood this immediately. Trauma affects perception. Distance affects perception. Angle affects perception. Even timing affects perception. Two honest witnesses can remember different details without either intentionally providing false information. That reality became central to everything that followed. Dorian Johnson, the friend walking beside Michael Brown, became one of the first and most significant witnesses. His account differed in important ways from Officer Darren Wilson's later testimony. Johnson described the initial verbal exchange differently. He also disputed key aspects of Wilson's description regarding what occurred after the first gunshot. Detectives documented his statement carefully, fully aware that it would become one of the most scrutinized interviews in the case. Officer Darren Wilson also provided his version of events. According to Wilson, the encounter escalated rapidly after Brown approached the patrol vehicle. Wilson stated that Brown struck him through the driver's side window and attempted to gain control of his firearm. He described fearing that if Brown succeeded in taking the weapon, both his own life and the lives of others could be in immediate danger. Wilson maintained that after the initial shot inside the vehicle, Brown fled before turning and moving back toward him, leading Wilson to fire multiple rounds because he believed Brown continued presenting a deadly threat. Those statements formed the foundation of Wilson's legal defense throughout the investigation. Meanwhile, detectives continued interviewing civilian witnesses. The difficulty became increasingly obvious. Descriptions varied considerably. Some witnesses believed Brown had moved toward Wilson during the final moments. Others insisted Brown had stopped moving. Several stated that Brown appeared to raise his hands. Others specifically said they could not clearly determine the position of his arms. A few witnesses later changed portions of their accounts after additional interviews, something investigators sometimes encounter in high-profile cases as memories evolve or become influenced by subsequent discussion. The inconsistencies frustrated both investigators and the public. People naturally assume that truth should emerge clearly when many witnesses exist. Reality is often far more complicated. Imagine standing on opposite sides of a busy street during a rapidly unfolding event lasting less than 1 minute. One person's view is blocked by a parked SUV. Another hears the first gunshot before looking up. Someone watching from a second-floor balcony sees movements impossible to observe from ground level. Each individual leaves believing they witnessed the event accurately. Yet their memories differ. This is not unusual. It is human. As interviews continued, forensic teams focused on evidence that could not be influenced by memory. The patrol SUV underwent detailed examination. Investigators documented bloodstains inside the driver's compartment. DNA testing later confirmed the presence of Michael Brown's blood within the vehicle, supporting the conclusion that physical contact occurred during the initial confrontation near the driver's side window. Ballistics experts examined shell casings recovered from the roadway. Their locations helped estimate where Officer Wilson had been standing as each shot was fired. Medical examiners carefully analyzed Brown's injuries. The autopsy documented multiple gunshot wounds affecting the head, chest, arm, and hand. Importantly, forensic analysis did not indicate wounds entering from the back in a manner suggesting Brown had been shot while running directly away during the fatal sequence. However, the autopsy alone could not determine Brown's precise movements immediately before each shot. Science answered some questions. Others remained stubbornly beyond its reach. As investigators worked quietly behind closed doors, Ferguson itself was changing by the hour. Crowds returned to Camfield Drive every evening. Flowers multiplied. Candles flickered after sunset. People prayed. People cried. People demanded answers. The phrase, "hands up, don't shoot," began appearing among demonstrators, reflecting the accounts of some witnesses who believed Brown had raised his hands during the final moments of the encounter. The slogan spread with astonishing speed. It appeared on handmade signs, T-shirts, murals, television broadcasts. For many protesters, the phrase represented more than a literal description of the shooting. It became a symbol expressing fear, frustration, and long-standing distrust toward police use of force. Investigators, however, approached the claim differently. Their responsibility was not determining symbolic meaning. Their responsibility was determining whether available evidence established precisely what had occurred. Months later, federal investigators concluded that witness accounts regarding raised hands varied significantly and that the available evidence did not establish that Brown had surrendered with his hands raised in the specific manner often associated with the slogan. That conclusion, however, did little to diminish the phrase's cultural significance. Symbols often survive independently of the events that inspired them. While investigators continued interviewing witnesses, another controversial decision dramatically intensified public anger. Several days after the shooting, Ferguson Police Chief Thomas Jackson publicly identified Darren Wilson as the officer involved. At the same press conference, authorities also released surveillance footage from Ferguson Market and Liquor showing Michael Brown taking cigars and struggling with a store employee shortly before the fatal encounter. Legally, investigators viewed the convenience store incident as part of establishing the broader timeline. Public reaction proved sharply divided. Many critics argued that releasing the surveillance footage at that particular moment unfairly shifted attention toward Brown's behavior before the shooting rather than the legal question surrounding Wilson's use of deadly force. Supporters of the decision argued that investigators should disclose all relevant information known about events leading to the encounter. Regardless of intent, the timing fueled additional controversy. Demonstrators interpreted the release differently from police officials. Trust, already fragile, deteriorated further. National media coverage expanded dramatically. Major television networks established live broadcast positions throughout Ferguson. Journalists interviewed residents, activists, police officials, legal experts, clergy members, and community leaders almost continuously. Every new witness interview seemed to generate another headline. Every leaked document prompted another debate. Meanwhile, inside investigative offices, detectives remained focused on details invisible to television audiences. Cell phone records, radio transmissions, dispatch logs, photographic measurements, forensic laboratory reports, medical evidence. Every piece required careful analysis before prosecutors could evaluate whether criminal charges were legally appropriate. Political pressure mounted from every direction. Civil rights organizations demanded accountability. Police organizations urged patience until investigations concluded. Federal officials announced that the Department of Justice would independently examine whether Brown's civil rights had been violated. Separately, the FBI began conducting its own investigation. Rarely had a local police shooting attracted such extraordinary attention so quickly. The legal stakes became immense. Every investigative decision would be examined nationally. Every statement issued by authorities would influence public confidence. Detectives understood that one mistake could permanently damage the credibility of the entire investigation. Yet despite thousands of investigative hours, one fundamental obstacle remained impossible to eliminate. No recording existed showing the complete encounter. Everything depended upon assembling fragments. Witness memories. Physical evidence. Scientific analysis. Professional judgment. Each fragment illuminated only part of the truth. By late August, investigators had accumulated hundreds of interviews and extensive forensic evidence. Still, public confidence remained deeply divided. Some Americans believed the evidence increasingly supported Wilson's account. Others believed the investigation itself reflected systemic bias. Neither side appeared willing to reconsider deeply held assumptions. The case had evolved beyond a criminal investigation. It had become a national referendum on trust. Trust in police. Trust in prosecutors. Trust in witnesses. Trust in institutions. Perhaps most importantly, trust in whether the American justice system could fairly evaluate an officer-involved shooting that had already become one of the most emotionally charged events in recent memory. Months would pass before the legal process reached its first major decision. But even before prosecutors presented evidence to a grand jury, one truth had already become unmistakable. Regardless of the eventual legal outcome, Ferguson had changed forever. The shooting was no longer simply about reconstructing less than 1 minute on Canfield Drive. It had become a mirror reflecting decades of accumulated questions about race, policing, power, accountability, and the fragile relationship between communities and those sworn to protect them. The investigation continued. The evidence grew. The arguments intensified. And somewhere beneath the weight of politics, grief, media attention, and public outrage, detectives continued searching for an answer to the same question that had confronted them from the very beginning. What, exactly, happened during those final seconds on that quiet Missouri street? By the beginning of autumn, Ferguson no longer resembled the quiet suburban city it had been before August 9th. Television satellite trucks had become as familiar as school buses. Reporters stood on sidewalks from sunrise until well after dark, broadcasting live updates to audiences across the United States and around the world. Protesters marched through streets that only weeks earlier had carried little more than neighborhood traffic. Every candlelight vigil, every confrontation between demonstrators and police, every press conference became another chapter in a story that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. Yet behind the television cameras and public demonstrations, investigators continued working inside conference rooms where emotion had to give way to evidence. Boxes of reports covered tables. Large photographs of Canfield Drive were pinned to investigative boards. Witness statements filled binders several inches thick. Every interview had been catalogued. Every forensic report had been reviewed. Every radio transmission had been transcribed. The investigation had entered its most difficult stage. Not collecting evidence. Interpreting it. The St. Louis County Prosecuting Attorney's Office faced a responsibility unlike any ordinary criminal case. Officer-involved shootings always receive extraordinary scrutiny, but this investigation unfolded under unprecedented public pressure. Thousands demanded an immediate indictment. Others insisted that Darren Wilson had acted lawfully. Neither public opinion nor political pressure could determine whether criminal charges were legally justified. The evidence would have to speak for itself. Or perhaps more accurately, investigators hoped it would. The problem was that the evidence did not tell one perfectly consistent story. The physical evidence proved invaluable in reconstructing portions of the encounter. It confirmed that a struggle had occurred near the driver's side window of Wilson's patrol vehicle. Brown's DNA was found inside the SUV. The discharged cartridge inside the vehicle matched Wilson's account that the first shot had been fired during the initial confrontation. Blood evidence helped establish Brown's proximity to the vehicle during that phase. Those findings narrowed certain possibilities. They eliminated others. But science alone could not explain intent. Science could not reveal fear. Science could not determine precisely what each man believed in those rapidly unfolding seconds. Attention then shifted toward the final moments on Camfield Drive. Ballistics experts carefully mapped every recovered shell casing. Laser measurements documented their locations with remarkable precision. Trajectory analysis helped estimate Wilson's movements as he fired. Medical examiners revisited every wound documented during the autopsy. Independent forensic specialists also reviewed portions of the evidence. Each expert approached the same physical facts from slightly different perspectives. Although individual interpretations varied in certain details, investigators generally concluded that the available forensic evidence aligned more closely with the possibility that Brown had moved toward Wilson at some point during the final encounter than with the theory that he had simply been shot while running directly away. Still, important uncertainties remained. Exactly how Brown moved. How quickly he moved. Whether he paused. Whether he stumbled. Those questions could not be answered with complete certainty. Meanwhile, detectives continued evaluating witness testimony. The sheer number of interviews created its own challenge. More than 100 people either claimed to have witnessed portions of the incident or believed they possessed relevant information. Not every statement proved reliable. Some witnesses admitted they had arrived after the shooting ended. Others had heard about events secondhand before speaking with investigators. A few accounts contained factual inconsistencies that conflicted with physical evidence. Investigators compared every statement against forensic findings, dispatch records, timelines, and one another. Slowly, patterns emerged. Certain witnesses independently described similar sequences. Others differed dramatically. The process was painstaking. No dramatic confession appeared. No hidden surveillance video suddenly surfaced. There was no single revelation capable of ending the controversy overnight. Instead, the breakthrough came through accumulation. One verified fact after another. One eliminated possibility after another. Like assembling an enormous puzzle with several missing pieces, investigators gradually narrowed the range of plausible explanations. At the same time, the Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted its own independent inquiry. Federal agents interviewed witnesses separately from local investigators. Their purpose differed slightly. Rather than determining only whether state criminal charges were appropriate, federal authorities examined whether sufficient evidence existed to pursue civil rights violations under federal law. That legal standard was even more demanding. To prosecute successfully, investigators would need evidence proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Wilson had willfully violated Brown's constitutional rights. The distinction mattered enormously. Many members of the public viewed the investigations as searching for general truth. Legally, prosecutors searched for proof meeting very specific standards established by criminal law. Those standards often differ from public expectations. An unanswered question does not automatically become criminal evidence. An inconsistency does not automatically prove guilt. Months passed. Public demonstrations continued. Trust between residents and authorities remained deeply fractured. Meanwhile, inside secure meeting rooms, prosecutors prepared one of the most closely watched grand jury presentations in modern American history. Unlike many criminal cases, prosecutors chose to present an unusually broad collection of evidence rather than recommending specific charges immediately. Grand jurors would hear from numerous witnesses. They would review forensic reports, medical findings, ballistic evidence, photographs, dispatch recordings, expert testimony. Most significantly, Darren Wilson himself agreed to testify before the grand jury. His testimony lasted for hours. He described the confrontation inside the patrol vehicle. He explained why he believed Brown had attempted to seize his firearm. He detailed the sequence of events as he remembered them unfolding after Brown moved away from the vehicle. Wilson repeatedly stated that he fired because he believed Brown continued presenting an immediate threat capable of causing serious bodily harm or death. Grand jurors questioned him extensively. Nothing about the proceeding resembled the brief courtroom scenes often portrayed in television dramas. The process unfolded carefully over many weeks. Every important detail received attention. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, Ferguson waited. Businesses boarded windows in anticipation of possible unrest regardless of the eventual decision. Church leaders organized prayer services. Community activists urged peaceful demonstrations. Law enforcement agencies developed contingency plans involving additional personnel should large protests occur. Everyone understood that the coming decision would extend far beyond one courtroom. The city held its breath. Then another major development emerged from the federal investigation. In addition to examining the shooting itself, the United States Department of Justice broadened its review of the Ferguson Police Department. Investigators analyzed thousands of municipal records, traffic stops, court documents, internal communications, use of force reports, statistical patterns. The review revealed issues extending well beyond August 9. Federal investigators concluded that Ferguson's policing practices reflected broader systemic problems affecting African American residents disproportionately. According to the later Department of Justice report, Black residents were stopped, searched, cited, and arrested at rates significantly exceeding their representation within the city's population. Municipal fines and court fees had become heavily integrated into the city's revenue system. Internal communications uncovered troubling examples of inappropriate conduct among some city employees. Those findings transformed the conversation. The case was no longer viewed solely through the lens of one fatal encounter. Attention increasingly focused upon institutional practices that had developed over many years. For many residents, the report validated concerns they had expressed long before Michael Brown's death. For others, it remained important to separate criticism of broader departmental practices from the legal evaluation of Wilson's individual actions. Both conversations now unfolded simultaneously. One concerned systemic reform. The other concerned criminal liability. They were related. They were not identical. As November approached, preparations intensified. Police departments throughout the St. Louis region coordinated emergency response plans. State officials monitored developments closely. National media organizations expanded coverage. Everyone anticipated the grand jury's decision. No one knew what it would be. The uncertainty itself became exhausting. For the Brown family, every passing week prolonged grief that had never been given an opportunity to settle. Each new report reopened emotional wounds. Each television interview forced painful memories back into public view. For Darren Wilson, life had become almost entirely private. Threats against him required extraordinary security precautions. His identity was known worldwide. Regardless of the legal outcome, anonymity had disappeared forever. Communities often imagine that investigations provide closure. Reality is rarely so generous. Investigations establish facts. Courtrooms apply law. Neither can erase tragedy. Neither can restore trust overnight. Neither can return lost lives. Still, the legal process had reached its decisive moment. Months of forensic analysis. Hundreds of witness interviews. Scientific testing. Federal review. Grand jury testimony. Everything now rested upon one question. Had prosecutors assembled sufficient evidence to establish probable cause that Officer Darren Wilson had committed a criminal offense under Missouri law? Within days, the answer would be announced. The decision would ignite another wave of demonstrations across the United States. It would change Ferguson forever. And it would ensure that the name Michael Brown remained permanently woven into the national conversation about justice, policing, and race for generations to come. On the evening of November 24, 2014, Ferguson seemed to stop breathing. For weeks, perhaps even months, the city had been waiting for this single moment. Businesses had covered their windows with plywood. Some owners quietly removed valuable merchandise from their shelves, fearing what might happen after the announcement. Churches opened their doors to anyone seeking comfort or simply a place to wait with others. Parents debated whether to let their children leave the house that evening. Community leaders urged calm while privately preparing for every possible outcome. Police officers from agencies across the St. Louis region reported for duty in unusually large numbers. Riot helmets rested inside patrol cars. Protective shields stood stacked beside command vehicles. Emergency medical personnel remained on standby. No one knew exactly what would happen. Everyone knew emotions would be overwhelming. Across the country, millions of Americans watched television broadcasts counting down to the grand jury's decision. Inside homes, people gathered around living room screens. In restaurants, televisions remained fixed on live news coverage. Social media platforms flooded with speculation. Supporters of Michael Brown expected criminal charges. Supporters of Darren Wilson believed the evidence justified his actions. Between those opposing expectations stood 12 grand jurors whose names remained confidential. For nearly 3 months, they had listened to testimony unlike anything most citizens would ever experience. Witness after witness had entered the grand jury room. Forensic experts explained ballistic evidence. Medical examiners described autopsy findings. Crime scene investigators reconstructed measurements taken on Camfield Drive. Dispatch recordings were reviewed. Photographs examined. Scientific reports analyzed. Most notably, Darren Wilson himself testified under oath for several hours, answering detailed questions about every stage of the encounter. Unlike a criminal trial, where prosecutors typically argue for specific charges, the grand jury's role was more limited. Its responsibility was to determine whether probable cause existed to believe a crime had been committed and whether criminal charges should proceed to trial. That legal threshold is considerably lower than proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet even meeting that threshold depends entirely upon available evidence. As darkness settled over Ferguson, St. Louis County prosecuting attorney Robert McCulloch stepped before television cameras. The room fell silent. He began explaining the investigative process. The presentation lasted far longer than many viewers expected. McCulloch described the extensive evidence reviewed by the grand jury. He emphasized the volume of witness testimony, the forensic examinations, the legal standards governing use of deadly force by police officers under Missouri law. Finally, the announcement came. The grand jury had decided not to indict Officer Darren Wilson on any criminal charge. Legally, the decision meant prosecutors would not proceed to a criminal trial under Missouri state law. Emotionally, it meant something very different depending on who was listening. For the Brown family, the announcement represented another devastating loss. No courtroom would hear the evidence before a trial jury. No criminal prosecution would move forward. The legal process they had hoped might provide accountability had ended before reaching open court. Family members reacted with visible grief. Some embraced one another. Others stood in stunned silence. No public statement could lessen the reality that their son remained gone. Across Ferguson, reactions unfolded almost instantly. Some people cried. Others shouted. Many simply stood motionless, struggling to absorb the news. Within minutes, peaceful demonstrations began forming. Marchers filled sidewalks carrying signs, candles, and photographs of Michael Brown. Prayers mixed with chants. Clergy members attempted to guide crowds peacefully through streets already crowded with police officers. For a brief period, many demonstrations remained orderly. Then the atmosphere began changing. As the evening progressed, isolated acts of violence emerged. Some individuals smashed storefront windows. Businesses were looted. Vehicles were set on fire. Gunfire was reported in several locations. Smoke drifted above commercial buildings as flames consumed structures that had served the community for years. Police responded with tactical units, tear gas, and crowd control measures intended to restore order. Images broadcast live across the world showed burning buildings illuminating the night sky while armored vehicles moved through Ferguson streets. Those scenes became almost as iconic as the shooting itself. Yet they represented only part of the story. Many protesters continued demonstrating peacefully throughout the night. Volunteers helped protect local businesses. Church groups offered food and water. Neighbors checked on elderly residents unable to leave their homes. The violence committed by some individuals existed alongside the peaceful determination of many others. Both realities unfolded simultaneously. Nationally, demonstrations spread far beyond Missouri. Crowds gathered in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Seattle. Dozens of cities witnessed marches demanding police reform and greater accountability. The death of Michael Brown had become more than a local tragedy. It had become a national movement. For Officer Darren Wilson, the grand jury's decision ended one legal chapter but not the public scrutiny surrounding his actions. Although criminal charges would not be filed by Missouri prosecutors, Wilson's future remained uncertain. He had become one of the most recognizable police officers in America. Threats against his life continued. His family required ongoing protection. Returning to ordinary police work appeared increasingly unrealistic. Only days after the grand jury announcement, Wilson resigned from the Ferguson Police Department. In a letter explaining his decision, he stated that remaining on the force might place fellow officers and members of the community at greater risk because of the intense attention surrounding his presence. His resignation did not settle the public debate. For supporters, it represented the end of a career shaped by circumstances few officers could imagine. For critics, it did little to address broader concerns about accountability. Legally, however, another important investigation remained unfinished. The United States Department of Justice had been conducting an independent federal civil rights investigation since shortly after the shooting. Unlike the state grand jury, federal prosecutors examined whether sufficient evidence existed to prove that Wilson had willfully violated Michael Brown's constitutional rights. The legal standard was extraordinarily demanding. Federal law required proof beyond a reasonable doubt that an officer intentionally deprived someone of constitutional protections while acting under color of law. Months later, in March 2015, the Department of Justice released its findings. After reviewing forensic evidence, witness testimony, physical evidence, and extensive investigative materials, federal prosecutors concluded that the available evidence did not establish beyond a reasonable doubt that Wilson had committed a federal civil rights crime. Accordingly, no federal criminal charges would be filed against him. That conclusion disappointed many who had hoped the federal investigation would produce a different outcome. Others viewed it as confirmation that both state and federal legal processes had reached similar conclusions independently. Yet the Department of Justice report did not end there. In a separate investigation examining the Ferguson Police Department itself, federal officials reached a very different conclusion. After reviewing thousands of municipal records and internal documents, investigators found evidence of systemic problems extending far beyond the Brown shooting. The report concluded that Ferguson's policing practices disproportionately affected African American residents. Black citizens were more frequently stopped, searched, cited, and arrested than statistical patterns alone would predict. Municipal courts relied heavily upon fines and fees that placed significant burdens on economically vulnerable residents. Internal communications revealed conduct inconsistent with constitutional policing and public trust. Those findings fundamentally altered the national conversation. The federal government had declined to prosecute Wilson individually. At the same time, it identified serious institutional failures within Ferguson's policing and municipal systems. Both conclusions existed together. Understanding the case required recognizing that they addressed different legal questions. One concerned an individual officer's criminal liability. The other examined systemic governmental practices. The distinction often became blurred in public discussion. For the Brown family, however, legal distinctions offered only limited comfort. No report, regardless of its conclusions, could restore the future they had imagined for Michael. His bedroom remained empty. Graduation photographs remained frozen in time. The ordinary milestones of adulthood, college, career, marriage, parenthood, would never arrive. Justice means different things to different people. For prosecutors, it means applying law according to evidence and established legal standards. For grieving families, justice often carries emotional dimensions that no courtroom can fully satisfy. For communities, justice may include accountability, reform, transparency, and trust. In Ferguson, those different meanings rarely aligned perfectly. As months turned into years, reforms gradually began taking shape. City leadership changed. Police policies were revised. Body-worn cameras became increasingly common across law enforcement agencies nationwide. Training regarding use of force and community engagement expanded. Municipal court practices underwent significant review. None of those changes erased August 9, 2014. But they reflected recognition that the events in Ferguson had exposed problems demanding attention. History often remembers courtroom decisions as final chapters. In reality, legal decisions rarely conclude society's deepest debates. The grand jury had spoken. Federal prosecutors had spoken. The Department of Justice had spoken. Yet conversations about Michael Brown continued across classrooms, police academies, churches, legislative chambers, and family dinner tables throughout America. The law had reached its conclusions. The nation was still searching for its own.